The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello everybody, thank you for joining the CECAN webinar today. I'm Lisa Fletcher, one of the 3 CECAN Centre Managers. For those of you who are new to CECAN, CECAN stands for the Centre for the Evaluation of Complexity Across the Nexus. We are a research centre funded by a group of research councils, government departments and agencies. Our aim is to test and promote innovative evaluation methods that take into account and are appropriate for the complexity of the world around us. We are looking in particular at nexus issues, the interlinked areas of food, energy, water and environment. If you want to find more about what we've been up to, including our latest contributions to the Magenta book, read our manifesto on our website www.cecan.ac.uk. Today's webinar is about evaluation under uncertainty, and our speakers are Stuart Astor from IOD Park and Simon Henderson, an independent evaluator. They're going to speak to us for about 45 minutes and then we'll have questions and answers. You may have noticed that you are not able to speak on this webinar. That's one of the flaws of the technology, I'm afraid, but you are able to submit questions. You will notice on your right-hand menu box a menu that says questions. Feel free to type in questions throughout the webinar and we will take them at the end. The session is going to be recorded and will be made available on our website at the end. So I will now hand over to Stuart.
Hello, everybody. Thanks for being there. It's a bit of a shame I can't hear everybody say hello back to me, which would be lovely. But there's just to repeat the thing about the questions. They can only be sent by text and everybody's muted. The other thing just to say is that if you have any problems seeing my slides, because obviously I can't see what you're seeing, I'm operating the set of slides. So if there's anyone that can't see those slides or there's a problem, it might also be worth putting a question in, and then I might see if I can fix anything, and our centre manager who's online can sort of have a go at me sorting that out. So anyway, just to introduce myself, which has already been done, I'm Stuart Astill. I'm working for the consultancy IOD Park on the CECAN project, along with a huge crowd of academics, some of whom are online today listening, and also lots of other people who are involved in evaluation and methodologies that are useful for evaluating complexity. So it's a nice big sort of multifaceted project, which I'm very happy to be part of, and online as well as my colleague Simon.
Hello everybody, I'm Simon Henderson and we're going to talk to you today about our work using Bayesian belief networks for the purpose of evaluation under uncertainty. So perhaps a little bit of background on the work we were doing. This was an evaluation. It was spread out about over, say, 30-month period approximately. In fact, it's still just coming to the end now. We're just in the process of completing the kind of third and final data collection point. But the program that we were evaluating, I suppose a brief outline of that is that it was a very small investment, relatively speaking, trying to promote transboundary cooperation in the governance of international water resources in South Asia. So it's spanning about 3 major river basins in the region and 2 landscapes, and involving in total 7 countries, 3 of whom I believe have nuclear weapons pointed at each other. In that sort of, it's a very long-term program. Our evaluation was this sort of a snapshot of the 30 months. And we were asked to basically assess the effectiveness of the program and whether it represented value for money. You can imagine, I'm sure a lot of you will be familiar with the sort of challenges that we faced. The usual for these sorts of programs, very unpredictable outcomes that are really only going to play out over a pretty long period, even though sort of our evaluation was a very finite window, snapshot. And of course, those outcomes are driven heavily by factors that are outside of the control of the program. And at the same time, because of the complicated and complex nature of those factors and those influences, it's very difficult to have any sort of reliable, consistent sort of source of, quote, objective data to sort of track what's going on. So that was the sort of context that we faced and the challenges we faced. We ended up tackling it from a number of angles. So there was a number of different sort of aspects to our evaluation approach, but the one that we wanted to talk about here was a particular part of it. That's the use of Bayesian belief networks.
Okay, so we're going to do this a little bit throughout the presentation, so you can get used to it now as we're going to sort of take separate sections of this. So I'm back again now for this slide. So where did these challenges lead us? And why was Bayesian belief networks something we would think? Well, first of all, there's obviously, given the time scale and the nature of the thing that we were looking at as something that was considered a good outcome, this was tied up a great deal with likelihoods, because there was also the possibility that this thing may never happen. But we'll get onto that in the next slide. The other place the challenge led was the subjective data, which needed to be treated with both a good deal of transparency, i.e. we didn't want to sort of paper over the fact that this data was subjective or try and sort of transform or elicit things that were objective by our questioning. We were accepting that most of the data here was going to be subjective, and we wanted to make sure that that was, as well as transparent, that was going to be some kind of rigorous treatment, or at least one that people could see the methodology behind it and reproduce our thinking, and if absolutely possible, they could even reproduce the method that brought us the findings. And the same thing again for the strength of influence that the different parts of this program were having on getting the result, and the massive uncertainty that was surrounding every element of it and each of the things in turn. So the first thing that was obvious was that theory of change ideas here were a useful model. So some kind of theory-based sort of link in there would be the best way to go, but that it was not straightforward, it was multifaceted, that there are these packages of influencing factors and combinations particularly of those, so sort of joint activities that may give a great combination, or certain things that exist in this sort of INUS combinations that some of you may be familiar with from other methodologies of trying to unpick this kind of thing, but we realized that that was a live thing. And all of that, given the fact that we both had some understanding knowledge about Bayesian belief networks and how they work, seemed to us that if we were going to put a proposition forward to do what was in essence a really challenging piece of work, that we would want to have a go at putting forward the BBN approach, because we thought that it was unlikely that you would find a better place to use it, and where its advantages, given all these challenges, would probably weigh out some of its disadvantages, probably the principal one of which is that it's not an easy thing to do. So that suggested to us that the BBN approach would be a pretty interesting way of going about it. So, sorry, I'm just trying to get the next slide up. Evaluating likelihoods was one of the key parts of that. Now, this isn't something, I don't think, and I've got a whole load of stuff that I could say about this, and I'm going to hopefully be writing a short EPPN, which is CECAN's sort of short 4-page publications about evaluating likelihoods. But there's something here about the fact that certain outcomes and impacts, rather than being something you can measure as a percentage or something that you can measure as, yes, it definitely happened in the time period, the outcome we wanted, or it didn't happen in the time period, that they can only be understood or examined as an increase or a decrease in the likelihood of that thing. And there's several reasons why that should be. So the first one is the thing that we're essentially talking about here. So for example, an intervention that tries to lower the chance of species extinction. Nothing you can do, are you able to put an intervention in place where, your objective on whether you succeeded and failed and everything you did would be that the species did or didn't go extinct. There's too many other things at play. What you would want to do is try and get an idea about whether you'd really shifted the odds on that thing, either in the sort of medium or longer term, that the things that you put into place were making a difference because they'd shifted the odds, not because they eliminated the chance of species extinction, which is just never a possible thing to aim for. You know, the second example is the example we're in. So looking to raise the likelihood that this transboundary management mechanism is going to exist at some point in the future. If you're talking about a treaty or a very strong and robust, formally constituted mechanism, this thing could take 20 plus years to get into place, but you're starting today and try and measure the effectiveness of what you do. So saying that you've increased the likelihood of that is something you do, and that leads us back to the subjective thing, is that there's going to be for the most part, that will be a subjective reasoning that decides whether you've achieved that or not. There is another version of this where likelihoods are important, but it amounts to the same kind of argument and the same necessity for thinking about it in this way, is that if this is, for example, a natural disaster, were it to happen. So if you're putting things into place to increase resilience or reduce fatalities given, for argument's sake, an earthquake, then you may want to put those things into place anyway, but you may never actually, within the period of the program, or even hopefully, if all lucky things come to pass, a long time after that, you wouldn't be able to measure the number of fatalities. What you'd want to be doing is to reduce the expected number of fatalities, the likelihood that fatalities would happen if an earthquake took place. So there are several reasons why we evaluate likelihoods, which isn't a particularly common thing to do, and so we had to sort of first of all build that in there. Simon.
Thanks, Stuart. And as part of this kind of broad sort of just teeing up the what we did, I did want to just also spend a couple of minutes talking about sort of the way we thought about value for money in this context. So, it was very apparent to us where you have such a sort of uncertain and unpredictable and sort of complex kind of outcome you're pursuing, that simply equating, success or failure of the program with good or poor, respectively, value for money judgments just was not really adequate. Obviously, donors, funders in these sorts of situations have got an interest in assuming risk, taking a chance, if you like, in order to try and solve what appear to be kind of intractable problems. But if they're putting assistance in those sorts of terms, then you have to accept that that there's a as yet kind of unquantified chance that it won't work. So this kind of got us thinking, well, if there's a real chance it won't work, well, how can we talk about value for money? And so we felt, yes, of course, you've got to have a grip on whether or not the program is using its resources wisely, and the sort of judgments it's making about where it applies resources, sort of thing. But the usual kind of grip on, how cost conscious as it is and so on and so forth. But beyond all that, it got us thinking about, we wanted to understand better, well, what does the funder actually understand about the likelihood of success? And, and what can we say about the likelihood of success? And separately, sort of, how does that understanding square with their kind of stated appetite for risk, their willingness to bear risk? Because I think from our point of view, if you may well have a program that proves ultimately didn't work, but if in the process the kind of the prospects of success are understood and matched to the donor's appetite, and the benefits of success are kind of commensurate with the cost, then you can still talk about it being value for money, even though you're not guaranteed success, and of course in many circumstances you wouldn't be successful when you're taking quite a long punt on something. So anyway, this was something that kind of was going through our head, and it reinforced this whole need for a good understanding of this kind of concept. What do we mean by likelihoods? How can we talk more concretely about this, about risk, and about understanding these things? So maybe Stuart, you could have the next slide, thanks. And then the sort of final kind of sort of teeing up point comes back to what Stuart was saying about the theory of change. And it being a useful vehicle for a study like this, of course, you know, very much interested in causality. Of course, we weren't doing an ex post evaluation and using it to sort of trace back, you know, what influences the program had, but rather we were sort of trying to look ahead and say, well, you know, what can it tell us about the kind of program's prospects and how effective it is? So we found kind of a theory of change, you know, you'll be familiar with them, sort of various names of them, but that sort of model was valuable for us as first of all, as a sort of framework to test the validity of the kind of premise the program is based on. You know, I mean, although we had to tease it out a bit, of course, you know, essentially this was the sort of, well, this is how the program thinks it's supposed to work, and this is what the investment's based on. Well, does that stack up? So we kind of, you know, through different means, went about testing that and seeing whether we thought, well, it held any water at all. But there's still a question then, that sort of for us, which was, well, even if it hangs together, you know, sort of how much can it explain, right? The chances of these things, how much can it really drive it? You know, even if you've got a sound theory of change, it doesn't necessarily mean that you pull a lever at one end and you get the thing out at the other end. And so we wanted a tool that could also help us explore these issues of causality and prospects and so on and so forth. And the fact that actually, even though the theory of change may be sound, it may only be a very small part of the picture. So what we then were faced with the challenge, of course, is that normally when these theories of change are sort of drawn, if you like, and some are better than others for sure, but they tend to be these kind of deterministic, you know, sort of models fixed. And we were looking for something that we could actually sort of play around with, which sort of, I'm going to hand over to Stuart now, who's going to pick up the story.
I will pick up the story now. I've unmuted myself. So, we're familiar with theory of change. And so the link through to here is the idea that the theory of change, as Simon said, is deterministic. And basically what it tells us is the theory, you know, if we do this, then that thing happens, you know, is a very deterministic idea. It gives you that theoretical link through the different things that the program is doing and the impact that that has on other things, and where it leads you down to your final impacts and outcomes, you know, at the far end of that chart. And this, you know, there's also, if you look on the CECAN website, you'll find some stuff around fuzzy cognitive mapping, and also this is also linked to systems mapping. Theory of change is one of that family of things. Now, the influence map that we use as one of the, you know, the key parts of the Bayesian belief network is that we get from the theory of change to the influence map. And the key thing to bear in mind before we go to that influence map is that that is now becoming a probabilistic rather than deterministic thing. So rather than saying if this thing happens, then that thing happens, we're saying given that this earlier thing was successful or wasn't successful in combination with some other things, what's the chances that the next thing down the line will have come off and that will have got that? So it's always this idea of these, given this combination of success or not earlier on, what's the chance of the current thing being a success? And so now I will click onto the version, which is sadly half covered up by my controls for this webinar, which I've now moved. So we have this, what we call the generic influence map. Now this was adapted for the different river basins and landscapes that we're looking at, because we had multiple cases. But basically this sort of sums up pretty much a good idea for you of the kind of things that were going on. So there's a few, you know, sort of notable things in here. The first notable thing is that unlike fuzzy cognitive maps, unlike systems maps, and to a certain extent unlike a theory of change, this strictly has to travel in one direction for the Bayesian analysis to work. So we have unlooped some of the feedback loops in this. So one of the main things we were asked was, you know, how do these, you know, surely some of these things come back and feed into earlier, to which the answer is yes, but we have to sort of take that into account in our interpretation of it rather than in our analysis of it. So we've de-looped it and de-feedbacked it. And the other thing is that you can see that this sort of travels from left to right in quite a neat way. And we've also got things in there that you wouldn't necessarily find in a theory of change, which because they're not necessarily about what the program is doing directly. So you'll see, for example, one of the pale blue towards the right of the chart is a space for collaboration. Now this is a purely good example of here's something which can influence what's happening later on and is influenced by earlier things, but then we still have other parts of the program feeding in and pushing into it. So the other thing that's notable is that the program support injects itself wherever it really is having an impact in this sort of process as it goes along. So, reasonably, there's program support being plugged into some of these early things that are important to get right if you're going to have success. You've got to get the evidence right. The theory of change says you've got to get the evidence right if you're going to have success later on. You've got to get the plurality. But then we'll see that it's injecting later on, either quite directly, a program support, for example, into the having well-informed investments, or it's injecting via a sort of little pathway going in there on discourse. So we can see that the green balls of program support are pushing in there. And leading through to the final outcome, which is the pale green ball on the right-hand side, which is our final sort of achievement, if this ever happens, of a cooperative transboundary mechanism. Now, the wording of this was, we thought through this quite a lot. We were trying to find things that would be meaningful to people, but not so precise that they would agonize for hours about being able to give us an answer. So there's and we'll get into that later, there's sort of a lot of tailoring has to go on here, a lot of sort of nuancing of things to make sure that you're eliciting the right kind of thing. So then to get onto the actual bit of the mechanism, the what we've called the analytical engine, is the Bayesian belief network. What we do is we pick off parts of this chart at a time, and we ask questions around, so in this case with the red rectangle, we ask the thing that's being influenced upon or being resulted on is the improved common knowledge base. And we would say, given some combination of the two things that are feeding into it, what are the chances that that one happens? Now, I'm just showing this because it's important at this point to realize that this is one of our approaches to trying to get rid of subjectivity, because this is actually quite difficult to game, because as you atomize this chart, it's actually quite difficult for you to game your responses in a way that would get the outcome that you want. I mean, we find it even really hard to predict what's going to come out of the software after we've been quite familiar with it, because in fact the Bayesian calculations are actually quite intricate and things that can pretty much only be done by a computer and the software. So here we get to the analytical engine. So for a Bayesian belief network, there are two key elements. There's the thing we've already seen, which is the map, telling you what is feeding into what and what's influencing what, and then there are the likelihoods or probabilities of that section of the map, and then by extension, when you've got them all, the chain linked probabilities of the whole map. So the grey table beneath the red rectangle simply is the way that we ask people. So we say the contributing factors are those two that are leading in with the arrow. So we say if both of those are achieved, so if we saw those happen, if the world was fortunate and lucky enough and everybody's been successful enough that they've been achieved, what's the chances that you would have an improved common knowledge base? And then again, here we're nuancing the question. We say an improved common knowledge base to the extent that would achieve the long-term aim. So, improved is a good question. These are never straightforward things to elicit, but improved to the extent that that will then lead you on to the next stage in this map. And then there's lots of, you can ask these in any order. Sometimes we found out that doing both and knocking one off, saying, okay, well, that's both. So what happens if you don't have the integrated and balanced evidence? You're just left with the more accessible. Or you can ask, okay, that was both. What would happen if you had neither of those things? How far would that drop like a rock if you had neither? And then you do it with each of the factors separately. So that's the way we elicit that, given either combination of the pale blue balls feeding into it, what's the chance that you'll get the darker blue ball at the end of it? They're conditional probabilities. Now, what's really interesting is when you are asking about both, you don't expect that if both factors are achieved, then you're definitely going to get, in this case, the improved common knowledge base. There's loads of other stuff going on. So you might only have, you know, a very small chance of getting that improved common knowledge base, even if you get both the contributing factors, or you may find out that with both those factors in there, you've got a very high chance of hitting it. It all depends on what else is going on, what else are the blockers or the enablers that are happening. So it might be dead easy to get an improved common knowledge base, and frankly, those two things, they're not going to make much difference. So you say, well, if neither were there, you know, it's 80%, and if they're both there, it's 85%. They don't make that much difference. We can elicit all those other things that are going on around it, and that goes on throughout the whole map. We build in all the everything else bubble is taken as being included in it when we elicit these probabilities in the table. And as we said, these are created based on the largely subjective data gathered from stakeholders. But fortunately, we believe it's quite difficult to game, which is especially important because, to be absolutely honest, especially in this case, and I think this is certainly true in other things I've done, the people who are the experts tend to be people who are in it. And unfortunately, people who are in it tend to have, you know, not an axe to grind exactly, but certainly things that they would find favourable if these evaluations came out in a certain direction. So the fact that it is quite hard to gain is very useful, but it's also about building that atmosphere of persuading people to be expert hats on rather than being sort of involved people that have got a hand in it. We're trying to seek sort of expert opinion. So when we've got all that, these grey, we'd have however many grey tables like that, very grey tables are required, you'll see that that will then go back in. So the improved common knowledge base then becomes later on a factor that feeds in. We would then have trying to elicit the opinions for quality overall transboundary dialogue. People would have to get their heads in a different place, because then the improved common knowledge base would be saying, well, given that you achieved that and any combination of the other two factors that feed into the transboundary dialogue, you know, what happened? And they then have to remember, well, I said there was only this much chance of achieving it, but now I'm saying, let's say we did. And then you have to shift their minds into that position. So this is quite a, you know, sort of an intricate thing to walk through in some cases, but that's why setting it up at the start to make sure that you've got the clarity and the nuances there, I think is quite important. So then after we've zoomed out from that, you can see Simon's going to pick up for you what we then do once we've got all these numbers of percentages and this rather nice structure that seems to explain what's going on.
Well, thanks, Stuart. Just before we get on to that, I suppose I just make an observation also about the kind of the process for eliciting the people's views. I mean, as Stuart's pointed out, there's a certain way of getting people to think, to get into it, and it is kind of nuanced and sort of intricate in many respects. But that said, once they get it, and normally people seem to get it reasonably quickly, it's actually kind of quite doable. So it can sort of sound somewhat hellishly complicated and very arduous, but actually it's often the longest conversations with the first node that we might be asking views on. And when people got the kind of hang of the kind of the method of inquiry, they sort of started to sort of roll with it quite well. And that was our experience on all occasions. Of course, if you do it again with people at a subsequent time, then, you know, they're already that much further into it as well.
I think the other thing to add there, Simon, sorry, just to interrupt, that's really interesting, you just made me think of it, is that we were really surprised when people thanked us afterwards that we'd been through the exercise, because so many things like this, where you're doing it for modelling purposes, it's actually getting into the nitty-gritty and eliciting that information from people that you need to put into the model. They actually found that a really powerful learning process in and of itself. So it wasn't, we actually found out, thankfully, we were really, really happy that we didn't seem to be eating people's time up collecting data off them. What we're actually doing was making them spend a bit of their time in reflecting back on what they'd done and thinking carefully about what did lead to what. And we were quite surprised when people thanked us. Maybe if we'd have thought harder about it, we would have realised that that would have been the case. But, you know, I think it did come as a bit of a relief.
Yeah, and so just to say then, before we get into the sort of a bit of examples about, you know, what kind of, Stuart's outlined the kind of the how, if you like, and then I'll talk a little bit about the what we could use it to, what information we get out of it. But as you can see, you know, just from looking at the map, the sort of what it's really doing is enable us to examine in really quite sort of interesting and rich detail stakeholders' beliefs about, you know, the likelihood of certain things occurring, and then the causality between different things in there, and what we can infer then about the kind of effectiveness or the prospects and so on and so forth of the program. So the sort of questions you can sort of ask of the model once it's been compiled. Stuart, you might want to flip it on. I mean, here's, I guess, the obvious one. To what extent did people think there was a chance that this cooperative joint management mechanism that they were pursuing in these different geographies in the region for different rivers and landscapes, what was it telling us about the chances? Now, we ran the exercise 2 times, and in fact we're in the process now of doing a 3rd data point to get a kind of a little bit of a sense of what's going on. There's a few things, I guess, to sort of, I should just explain a little bit here. I mean, the blue dots and the arrows are the kind of instances of data collection, if you like. So a dot might be an individual, a key informer, it might be a group. But where there's two or more dots on a particular graph, that was because there were sort of 2 separate data collection exercises for that particular case that we looked at. And as I said, we asked them at 2016 in a kind of baseline type assessment, and then we asked them again in 2017, and we're actually repeating the exercise currently in 2018. Headline, you know, figures out of this, you can see sort of on balance, I think you'd sort of conclude that in all the 3 cases we've got here, the likelihood is, the likelihood of this cooperative management mechanism being achieved in the next 5 years is kind of less likely than more likely overall. The fact, the shifts, the direction of the arrows shows you that in the case of basin number 1, over the period of time that we spoke when we first did it to the second exercise, people's assessments of the prospects have declined. And these were 2, if you like, sort of separate independent data collection exercises, but you can see they both moved in that direction. In basin 2, this is an interesting one in that, you know, I'll talk a bit more about that in a minute, but you can see again there was a general improvement in prospects. There was a shifting there and sort of showing people's, again, independently all moving in the right direction, same direction. And then in the sort of landscape number 1 there on the right hand side, there was no really sort of significant shift, a slight improvement, but not much in it really. Still sitting in and around the kind of 1 in 3 chance of it actually coming off. I guess I'll probably just stress as well and emphasize, in case it's not obvious, that when I'm talking about these prospects of achieving it, the process doesn't involve asking people what's the prospects of achieving it. This is the result. This is what the model tells us, you know, is the result of the compilation of all their different assessments, all the preceding factors and other things that aren't even in the model, when they're judging the likelihood of things happening and not happening and what difference that makes to the next part of the model. The process compiles it up, the Bayes kind of algorithm will compile it up through you and give you an overall assessment of what the chances are at the end. So this isn't sort of a direct question to them. This is what the model was kind of telling us through the 2 exercises we did. I guess also it's interesting to note that over time, and although 2016 there were a number of experts involved in this, it wasn't exactly the start of the program when we got involved. You can see a kind of convergence, certainly for those, obviously the landscape one, there was just 1 data collection exercise with a big group, but for the first and second basin was more than 1 sort of separate data collection exercise, and in both cases we got over that time a kind of convergence of the what the kind of model was saying was the prospects based on it. And it's quite interesting, certainly in the case of the second basin, where you see that sort of big spread at the start. There was a lot less known about that and a lot less experience with the kind of different actors involved in it. It was a sort of a, if you like, a rather, you know, sort of neglected area of study and knowledge and research, etc. So it was sort of perhaps not surprising that people had quite different views. And although, you know, they're still not exactly all on the same spot with their judgment about the direction of travel, or rather what the prospects are, there was that kind of the shift, and the kind of has been in a similar direction, and you get again a kind of narrowing of the range of results being produced by the three kind of separate runs of the model based on those three separate data exercises, which I think is quite interesting. That it implies at least some sort of sense of the kind of learning, and that, you know, it's happening as it goes in terms of people's views.
Sorry, can I just add there, Simon, that that's where the qualitative information that we picked up alongside the numbers. So I just showed you the grey table, but we also sort of, obviously we're part of a conversation, and we were noting down the qualitative things that were behind it. And what we know for sure is that only one thing's happened in that basin, but the way that different people perceive it and their increased knowledge and what they've seen and their perception can vary. So the matching up of between what their perceptions are changing and what the reality, you know, from anybody's point of view is in the basin, we know there's only one reality, then weaving together what we find from the model and what we get from that qualitative, you know, sort of more rich data that we collect on the qualitative stuff around during those data collection exercises sort of is the kind of the art layered over the science in this, really.
Yeah, and I think that's right. And so what I was going to add was this point that, you know, in the process of collecting the data and working through the models, when people are expressing a view, you know, you can sort of, particularly when you're doing it the second time, you can check back and say, you can see that how it's changed compared with previously. And you can probe and you can ask why. And you can really get a kind of explore what are they basing their judgments on. So you're looking to kind of sort of look for that corroboration. Why are they saying that? And in particular, why changing their views? What accounts for that? What factors are they sort of feeding in when they make that judgment? So you can explore and unpack all that and build that picture up alongside it as kind of corroborating and kind of triangulating, because you can go and ask other people about that, you know, not necessarily using the model, but those factors. You can see whether or not those things are happening. It's just that it's difficult to predict what factors will happen and what will be influential on people. But in doing it this way and sort of real time working through it as the program is being implemented, you can sort of track on what things are coming into play in people's minds. So yeah, you can build that all up around it. Now, of course, that's looking at the kind of, you know, what's the chance of success. But what the model actually allows you to do as well is that you can peel back, you can look at intermediate outcomes. You know, what's the chance that we'll get good quality transboundary dialogue? If that's nearer to home, you know, you can have a look at what's going on. You can even start analysing some of the dialogues to say, are we seeing that coming through now? So you can unpack different bits, and you can look at, in particular, well, what seems to make more of a difference? Of course, it's still premised on the fact that it's what people believe is making a difference, and what you know, what people think is important. But when you combine that and compile it in the model, you can start to look at, well, kind of packages of things and what seems to have the bigger kind of influence on the end outcome. And that sort of allows all sorts of sensitivity analysis and so on and so forth. And even, you know, kind of working backwards, you can sort of click on the model to say, let's say this has actually happened, and it will tell you the most likely combination of factors, you know, or what factors seem to be most influential in that, based on, again, the kind of, you know, people's, if you like, mental model that they're working to. And a particular example of this, of course, question of like, well, what makes a difference is in a lot of cases the sort of $64,000 question, you know, what difference is the program making? In our case, you know, using the tool, you can to some extent artificially, but as a kind of researching it, you can switch the kind of program on and off, right? You can have it with the program, you can have it without the program. So if you take the kind of results we got for the 2017 data collection exercise, you can then say, okay, well, if that's what people think, what happens if we just take the program out of the picture in all those different nodes that Stuart showed previously, where the program was kind of intervening in the sort of model? What happens if we say, well, there wasn't a program there? What difference does that make? And you can see that with the program, in every case, people's perspective is that it makes a positive difference. But it's less than 10 percentage points to the overall chance overall. I guess the first observation we'd have is that doesn't seem unrealistic at all when you're talking about trying to influence transboundary governance in South Asia with a pretty small program. But I guess the question really is that, you know, for the donor, for example, is that, well, is moving the needle, you know, in terms of the chances from 30% to 35% or nearly 40%, you know, is that considered worth it? And it allows you to kind of look at that and have those kind of conversations. And this links back to the point I was making also about kind of risk and risk appetite, you know, and the sort of, what sort of level of kind of chances of non-success are you prepared to bear, and sort of, you know, what's your risk appetite? Stuart, do you want to add anything to that? You have to unmute.
So going off mute, yeah, I'd just say that, yeah, so effectively you can, you know, one crude way of putting it that we would never ever do is, you know, so what have you just bought with your money? You know, you've bought this increase in likelihood. And that is certainly one way of looking at it. And the way that we, you know, did that with VFM was built around that idea. But, you know, the idea that that gives you, you know, any sort of, you know, incredibly strong grip on that is not right. It's more about, as Simon said, that your risk appetite is a better way of thinking about it, rather than sort of doing, you know, a strict translation into money. But you can bet anything you want that as long as someone thinks you can do that strict translation into money, they'll ask you to do it. But, you know, nonetheless, thinking about it in terms of risk appetite and the shape of that risk appetite is a much better way of going. So this approach, we're desperately hoping by giving this seminar that, you know, the place that we used in it isn't the only place that it will ever be useful, and so we just thought it was worth having a think about sort of, you know, what are the generalized features, what sort of thing is it that we're talking about here where this tends to fit in with, and this sort of flows on a little bit of a reiteration in some ways. Now you've seen what happens, when can it be used? So the first thing is that, you know, it's pretty sure that this is a kind of, for programs that are ongoing, they've got a longest time frame. They're not stuff that's just going to be sort of, you know, sort of suddenly in, done, and suddenly out again. You know, this needs a little bit of time to see it mature, and it's the advantage of it is it gives you the chance to assess that, even if the end point is a long way away, maybe even outside the boundaries of the program. And in that sense, that's got value for, you know, ideas that are linked to the same kind of things as developmental evaluation. Obviously, here we are at CECAN, we're not presenting here by accident. If you've got complex causal chains, particularly these multiple aspects of interventions that are sort of interweaving and working together in ways that may not be entirely obvious about how, what the pathways are that they do support each other, but through the Bayesian calculations, you can actually find the ways that they intertwine and work out what is the effect of different combinations of things happening in those likelihoods. So for the, you know, these complex and multifaceted interventions, it's pretty useful. And where there's, you know, high uncertainty about, you know, what works and what it leans towards and how it happens. And particularly this is interesting in cases where you've got the opportunity to do sort of cycles within cycles of learning. So you're learning on the program as it goes along, you're learning about the program, that can feed back into the way that you are thinking about the evaluation and the questions that are being asked within the evaluation. And so you're learning in parallel and in multiple loops about the program itself and the way that you're evaluating that program in parallel. So that seems to be, there are some facets of the kind of thing where this can certainly add enough value to make it worthwhile doing. Simon.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, obviously, we've been applying it in that, really kind of complicated, ongoing, hard to predict, etc. Very paucity of objective data setting. But, I think from our perspective, there's also, I guess those of you familiar with kind of, use of theories of change, logic modeling, etc. in, I guess, other kind of ex post evaluation would kind of potentially see the potential applicability here, really, in any kind of essentially a qualitative overarching design, evaluation, but the one that's trying to explore causality in any kind of depth from an ex post perspective. You can use the tool in the same way you sort of might build a theory of change in order to sort of look at contribution, explore those kind of avenues. You can actually, in a sense, what the tool gives you is, rather than just that, as we said before, a kind of deterministic map where you kind of go and try and find the data about different bits, and then you have these isolated bits of information about each part of the model, and you kind of weigh that up and think, well, how does that add up? The model itself, in a sense, will compile that, will help you compile that through for you, and you look at actually the kind of influence of different parts on the whole. So you can sort of then use it to conduct all sorts of kind of what if and sensitivity analyses to examine questions of contribution and influence, and what made a difference, what didn't make a difference, what could make a difference, and so on and so forth. And there's also, interesting possibilities also to kind of overlay, cost data to say, because often programs that, they've got multiple different types of interventions, they're doing different things, they're trying to sort of nudge the system that they're working on in different ways, and you can look at, well, what seems to be the kind of the scope to what sort of returns, if you like, the marginal returns you're getting for those different areas of work. And of course, if you've got, I mean, objective is a kind of a, the more you look into a term like that, the harder it is to pin down, really. But if you sort of have something that's a bit more explosive, is a bit more kind of factual about what has happened, well then, you can sort of have more certainty in the model as well, which can kind of expose also kind of the kind of allows different avenues to explore the kind of way that things may have contributed to things, and so on and so forth. You can play around with that. But I mean, I just sort of say that, of course, we're talking about it, and we're trying to sort of, I suppose, in a sense, sounds like we're trying to sell it. I mean, we are quite enthusiastic about it, but we definitely would recognise the need to kind of keep it in perspective. There's no way that we're suggesting that, it provides this kind of, sort of truth about, what will happen or what has happened per se. But it is a tool that is really, I think, really quite interesting, that enables you to examine in detail what people's beliefs, tell us about what is important and was important, and what are the chances of success, and so on and so forth. And of course, in all cases, these judgments, these beliefs are actually more important than is often admitted. And in some cases, it's often all you've got to go on. So it provides a tool to kind of quite transparently and rigorously unpack those and analyse them and say, okay, well, if you believe this and you believe that, what are the implications of that for how we understand, causality in this setting? We'd also say that, you can do it as a one-time exercise, just as sort of looking back, and it's going to give you some insights. But, as we've been at pains to point out, it's sort of, it's not giving you a kind of a truth in that sort of sense, but it really, the kind of value in our perspective is if you can run it a few times, if you can do it over a period of time for active programs, you can really explore that understanding for the sort of the way things are changing and why views are changing. So, the kind of classic double loop learning that people talk about. So we're not just finding out, well, did that happen or didn't it? But people's views change about, well, how important things are. And you could even get to the sort of level whereby you might say, well, how would you almost redesign your kind of theory of change model restructure it in the light of evidence. So in settings where there's a lot of uncertainty, it's got real value there, I think. But you know, it does then mean, you know, you've kind of got to be able to run it a few times and you know, and take those exercises and get engaged with people who work alongside. So it's not sort of a kind of an easy, just whip it out of the bag necessarily tool. And then I think Stuart made this point right at the start about the fact that it is essentially a linear model. So it's not, it can't accommodate kind of feedback loops. You can't get a solution when that happens. So it's not the answer to complexity by any means, but it does feel like to us at least that it can sort of help help with understanding certain aspects of that.
Right, so the final slide that we've got is on what we think some of the future directions of this work that we've been doing could be. And it's kind of a little bit of this is sort of incredibly future, exciting, forward-looking stuff to make it more sophisticated and wonderful. And frankly, some of it is about getting the basics right and things that we know that other people are, you know, sort of going about with other things such as the fuzzy cognitive mapping and, you know, other similar methodologies that you know exist all over evaluation. That just getting some of those basic right, you need to have more work on it if you want to, you know, increase the rigor and the certainty that you're doing this right. So the first one is obviously listing these conditional probabilities in a way that minimizes the risk of bias. We've talked a little bit about how it's quite hard to game this sort of way of atomizing the map down and answering specific questions about, given this combined with that, what would that do? But, you know, we do need to think more about that and exactly how we can avoid biases, not just of people, conscious biases because they want to promote a certain view on the program, but also unconscious biases of just the way that human brains are not renowned for their ability to handle thinking about probabilities particularly well anyway. So we're concerned with that and we want to do more work on that. We're also interested in estimating the certainty that people of when they give us their estimate, they say, right, okay, that's 70% likely to happen. You know, we want to think about how we can start to establish a little bit, you know, whether that 70% feels really solid to them and they're pretty sure that's a good estimate, or this is one of the things where they feel less certain. What does the distribution look like around that? Because then we might be able to do something that might be like Monte Carlo, or might be putting bounds on things with some kind of sensitivity analysis. That's a sophistication type one. Here's a pretty, you know, sort of difficult and basic one. Everybody faces this problem to some extent, is how do you aggregate or combine multiple active views? I just noticed a question come up that this addresses a little bit. You know, in some cases, we took individuals and we asked them separately to fill in these details. Sometimes we had people in a room and we talked it through with them and they knocked it around a bit and came up with a consensus view within the room. And sometimes we had people in the room and they talked together, but we took their individual figures and we treated that separately, but they'd already heard the group conversation. We could see where people were sort of dissenting, if that's not too harsh a word to use, from the thing. So there's something about exactly how you go about this, which gives the best kind of solution to that multiple people question. Defining and ensuring sufficiently consistent interpretation of occurrence and non-occurrence. I alluded to this earlier. You know, you say, oh, well, you know, what's the chances of this thing happening? A decent knowledge base. You know, well, how do you say whether a decent knowledge base has occurred or not occurred when you come to imagine it to answer the questions of if it was given, but also when you're working out what the likelihood is of that thing happening? It's very rarely that we're going to have, you know, the egg broke, the egg didn't break. You know, that's a nice occurrence, non-occurrence. Mostly these are sort of contexts that have reached a certain point, or, you know, much more difficult to put your finger on exactly whether it's there or not. And finally, you know, the sensitivity of the results to that model design. You know, the question is, to what extent does that influence map that had to be put into place before you could do the analysis, if you'd have chosen a different influence map at the point where you started doing the analysis? Now, we actually went through that with the stakeholders to try and make sure that it was the best one that everybody agreed on. But nonetheless, you know, how sensitive is it if you sort of remove a link here or add a link there, or shift a few things around, or put an extra bubble in as an intermediate step? So, you know, we need to sort of do more work and have more time to look at that kind of sensitivity as well. I believe that is the end of our presentation. There's our contact details on the slide at the end, because I'm sure everybody's burning with questions. We've got a few already on the screen that we've got a small amount of time to handle. What's the time now? So we can we've got about sort of 6 minutes or so to take some of these questions. Oof, there's some detailed ones here. Simon, is there anything you're going to pick off? Can you see that we've got your questions coming on a pane on our screen? So I feel a little bit like a quiz show host now.
It looks like to me there's a couple of questions around the kind of elicitation, and somebody's made the point as well about that there are kind of protocols for expert elicitation, for structured approaches, and some information there. And the short answer is yes. We kind of had a fairly sort of, I guess, pragmatic approach to it, because we had sort of people that were a sort of different sort of like levels of engagement with it. But we definitely, you know, those sort of techniques, that's right, to get people kind of orientated, right? We had, obviously, you can sort of work with, you know, do you think it's more likely or less likely, these kind of things. So you can sort of, basically a process of helping people hone down onto it when they'd indicated whether they were sort of like either like below or below 50 or 50-50, they've got no idea really on that particular question. And then obviously the extent to which, you know, how strong their feeling was. We then of course probed that with kind of questions about why are you so confident, or what makes you feel, are you sure there's not, have you considered it, etc. Because one of the biggest challenges of course is we're not, you know, we're also asking about these things in context, and they're big. There's a lot of other factors that may not be on the map, which you're asking them to hold on. So that's an important question about how detailed the map is and how detailed it isn't. But anyway, making sure that those things were being constantly kind of like considered. And then because you're asking them about a number of different scenarios, for example, you know, if you've got 3 parent nodes going into something, then, you know, you've got a number of kind of scenarios you've got to kind of trace through with them. And you could then play that back with them in terms of saying, okay, now you seem to think this is more important than that, you know, from your answers. You've rated these 2 without that more important than these 2 without that. And you can sort of test and check the logic and check they're happy with it and go through it. So it's kind of, on the sort of more complicated notes, it's a fairly kind of involved process of checking back, feeding back, playing back, and probing why they think it, and using kind of, you know, parameters to sort of help them scope in to start with. The only other thing I would add to that, it's not a very complete answer, I know, but the model itself, you know, often is kind of not massively sensitive to sort of whether somebody picks 85 or 80, you know, % on something. I think it makes a difference if somebody thinks it's sort of, you know, 55 or 80, i.e. they're kind of marginal in terms of they're not really sure, a little bit edging towards more likely, versus quite confident. But it's those kind of ranges which sort of, you know, you're working with, which is quite reassuring as well. So that's what we say about that. I'll probably use that all the time. Do you want to answer a question, Stuart?
There's just the question of why it's better to do this, from Heather asked this, why it's better to do this than asking people to talk about the likelihood of achieving the outcome in some kind of qualitative sense. I think it's that now in some senses we do get a sense of that anyway. You can imagine that when we're in this, you know, it's not difficult without asking the direct question to get a mood with quite a lot of qualitative information about, you know, what the chances they think are that there's ever going to be, you know, this transboundary mechanism established. So we do in fact get that, and we get it with some quite rich qualitative data. I think the advantage with this is it allows us to unpick what are the important preceding elements and the size of the influence that they may have on that. And we can even measure to some extent the difference between what we've picked up as a qualitative judgment on this, because we did quite a lot of, so obviously, as we said right up at the start, this was one element of the overall work that we did for the evaluation. So we did do a fairly extensive survey of people that both were involved in the sector and people that attended or were part of certain parts of these interventions, like the knowledge improvement and the sort of governance and dialogue things. And what we did was we asked them what did they think was important, and how did they think that these things went in a sort of classic qualitative sense. But we are able then to triangulate what we find from this sort of atomized questioning of and this is the answer to the what makes it Bayesian part, the what's the chances of this given these things that precede it, we're able to triangulate and compare, and sometimes we find out, in fact, the thing that everybody said was really, really important, when you got down to getting people to make these assessments and then running it through the network and finding out its final impact on the end objective, maybe there was a disparity there. So it was interesting then to dig even further into the qualitative and ask more questions and say, well, what made you think this was important? Because in fact we're, you know, not necessarily give away that we found out that it wasn't, but dig a little bit further in. So it gives you that ability to triangulate the sort of purely sort of qualitative you know, opinion that people give you based on something that is revealed to you by the answers they give once you've aggregated them, and that's just an interesting, you know, sort of further triangulation. As I say, this was part and parcel of a bigger set of things that we were doing.
Stuart, I'm going to quickly pick up the very first question that came in, which was, could you segment the stakeholders at all? I mean, the short answer is that we had a broader approach, of course, and this was part of it. So we had sort of segmenting the kind of stakeholders, different categories of stakeholders, those more directly involved, government, civil society, those with a sort of stake in it versus informed expert opinion. You know, we sort of identified a number of kind of informants in the sort of broader thing that we were in touch with in surveying, etc. Within the actual tool here, given constraints, etc., we focused on the partners working on the programme. But we sort of broke those up in most cases between the different types of institutions, the institutions they represented, except on one, because we were interested in trying different ways, we sort of did it as a participatory group. On another occasion, we sort of did it as a group, but took separately their views, and on another occasion, we interviewed them completely separately. So there was a bit of that sort of segmenting going on, but you're absolutely, you know, it's quite interesting to look at the different perspective we got, say, from a civil society partner versus, you know, multilateral development bank partner. But not always wildly different either. It was quite interesting. It wasn't just about, you know, the classic, you know, two perspectives you might expect.
Yeah, and with that atomization, you can actually look at the answers that people gave you in terms of whether they gave you the same answer on the grey table. I mean, you can see whether, when it all shakes down, actually, even though they may have been different in different areas, when it all shakes down, do you actually end up with a similar, you know, sort of set of results when you look at, you know, the difference over time, or the difference if you leave these things in or take these things out, and the impact of the program and so on. So it allows you to sort of do, as you know, and this is what Simon and I found is in fact the amount of, you know, digging around and tweaking and fiddling and analysis that you can do out of that. There's so many questions that you could answer with it that there's no way you can possibly, you know, spend your time doing it all. And this is why, you know, hopefully people picking this up and using it further and seeing things that we haven't seen is going to be useful. I think we have to end there, Simon, unless we've got anything burning. I mean, there are more questions that we haven't answered. The slides.
Let me just if people are still there, I'll just pick up. There was a couple around. That were kind of a little bit into the detail of it. There was one about, you know, do you have to have binary evaluations? And there was another one about expert opinion, weighing it once you've seen the success. Because I think I can deal with those quite quickly. Yeah. And it means it'll be easy, then we don't have to follow up. I don't know, actually, I suppose I should check if those people are still here. I might be talking to no one in particular. But anyway, in short, we had not seen, if you like, evidence of change in quite the sort of definitive way that would enable us to say this person's opinion was better than the other person's opinion over the period of 12 months that we did. You know, there was all sorts of stuff going on, in the region, and different reasons why, you know, people's views were changing. All we were doing really, we often sort of checked across views in order to look for consistency or inconsistency, but we didn't really have any kind of those, like, if you like, really concrete examples of, oh, that did happen that way. These people knew what they were talking about, and these people didn't. So we weren't in that kind of position to do that. The second question about, does it need to be binary? The answer is no. It makes it more involved if you have, you know, the more kind of categories, if you like, of outcomes you allow in the nodes, of course, because you've got to have a kind of, you know, scenario for each one of those, you know, and a process of questioning. So it does have implications for the kind of depth and the sort of demands of the process, our view was really that because of the kind of pretty wide-ranging, amorphous, big, 7 countries, this small program doing these different things involving dialogues and promoting this and doing some research and stuff, we sort of thought, well, you know what, something which kind of hangs together and is relatively simple for people to get their heads around and relatively tractable is probably in the end going to give us 90% than if we went into all the kind of detail. But I mean, I can't prove that, and that's a sort of, sensitivity analysis and sort of work that one might do, developing this idea of, well, how much the way you construct the model, how much does that influence the outcome?
Yeah, I noticed that Tabassum is online, and I know she's working on a paper that is also, involved with Bayesian belief network. So there's more stuff coming out of CECAN as well, and hopefully out of Simon and I. And if people have got questions, then feel free to drop us an email. Especially if there's you think that there's work to be done, or things that we can sort of contribute to by making or feedback from things that that are certainly things that do impact on this. I mean, I think having a conversation ongoing about this is really useful, and hopefully this is the first step. Simon and I are hoping to produce something written that will come out of CECAN to follow on from this, so there'll be something available that people can use as a reference, but also the slides are definitely going up on the CECAN webpage, as is the recording of this event, which people can then obviously spread around to their contacts and friends or enemies, depending on how much you like or dislike people. So that'd be great to do that. I think that we've timed out now. Thanks everybody for listening. And is there anything that you need to add from the centre point of view?
No, thank you. You've said it for me already. We will send an email to all participants and anybody who's registered, informing them when the slides and audio recording are available. Thank you everyone for joining today. I hope to see you or hear from you at future webinars.
Great, thanks everybody.
Thanks, bye.
Cheers.